another individual who's also recently returned from traveling abroad. He's Ambassador Bader Omar al-Dafa, who is the ambassador of Qatar to the United States. And it is particularly appropriate that he is the moderator for this last session, inasmuch as Qatar not only has a very special bilateral relationship with the United States, not only that Qatar plays, despite its small size, an outsized role in regional and world affairs, especially in the world of energy, but that Qatar holds the chair of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which is the single largest organization on the planet, grouping the 57 Islamic countries. And we have Ambassador Chaz Freeman, formerly our ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Regional Security Affairs, and president of one of the co-sponsoring institutions of this conference, Middle East Policy Council. But Bader al-Dafa has been for more than a quarter of a century a diplomat on behalf of his country. He served with distinction in Europe, lengthily in France, and also in Moscow before returning back to the United States, a place from whence he began his diplomatic career. Bader al-Dafa.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We seem to have reached the end of the road and came to the last round of our fruitful discussion. But the end of the road is a question that literally says, where do we go from here? Thanks to the work that have been done in previous panels, we have now where we are, and we can prepare to wage forward. I think I got my paper mixed up here. Excuse me for a second, just to put them in order. Thank you. It is like travel in the desert. Only this time we shall have two expert guides to take us from oasis to oasis, from water hole to water hole, so that we do not lose track and die of thirst. Those worthy guides, as His Excellency Ambassador Hussein Hassouna and Ambassador Chaz Freeman, Jr., former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Regional Affairs, and current President of the Middle East Policy Council. Of course, Ambassador Hassouna is the Chief Representative of the League of Arab States of the United States. These two distinguished scholars will now guide us to our destination. I am sure that they will lead us to lush green of an oasis of friendship and a fruitful partnership between the United States and the Arab world. Being a man of the desert myself, I hope it is in order for me to say a few words about the road ahead. Arab-US relations before 9/11 were at peak. Economic relations were flourishing. Strategic cooperation was expanding, and numbers of Arab students and researchers in the U.S. was reaching record level. Now all this has been reversed and replaced by mutual ill-feeling. To begin with, we should endeavor to go back to the point government to government and business to business relations are rational affairs that can be easily retrieved, but people-to-people relations are more difficult to deal with. Elements of vindictiveness have clouded the picture. Deliberate anti-Arab propaganda inflames such feeling by calling for unfriendly measures against major Arab states. Now, the legitimate feeling of bitterness must be addressed, and the anti-Arab propaganda must be faced and defeated. In both arenas, there is a need for mutual understanding. Public diplomacy of both parties has a vital role to play in explaining what happened and getting over it. I would like to mention to relevant program initiated by the State of Qatar as a moderate contribution to this regard. It consists of two parts: 80 full scholarship for American students to study in Qatar and gain first knowledge of Islam and Arab studies over the next 10 years. Two Qatari prizes for junior university professors who will come out with the best papers on U.S. relation with the Arab world or with the Islamic world. Adoption of similar programs by Arab nations would result in a body of academic interest and research and would deepen mutual understanding. A huge obstacle in the way is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If viewed in that perspective, Arab has seen as the enemy of America's friend, and America is seen as the friend of our enemy. We are not allowed to see each other as friends in our own right, but we are, despite the shrill voice heard on either side. The peaceful resolution of the Middle East question would remove most of the differences between us. It is guaranteed that fanaticism will die out in our region and democracy would prevail. In other words, the forces that unleashed 9/11 are the same forces that are preventing the Arab world from moving forward towards social and political progress. These forces are not called Islam. They are called fanaticism, extremism, fundamentalism. Make your pick. Ladies and gentlemen, all in all, the sad memories can and should be brought to an end. So should be my ramblings. I should cede the place to the next speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Chas Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bader. I know Ambassador Bader al-Dafa as one of the most effective Arab ambassadors, indeed, ambassadors from any country in this capital, who runs his embassy on business principles, which is rather a good thing, I think. It's an honor to share this podium with you, Ambassador, with Ambassador Hussein Hassouna, and with General Franks. I've been asked to provide a few reflections on a war, another war for me, with Iraq. I must say that I was a very strong supporter of military action to counterattack Iraq and to liberate Kuwait in 1991. Indeed, I may have made my own small contribution to persuading that President Bush to do that. I remain unconvinced and full of many more questions than answers as I look at the situation today. Over the course of the day, I gather, various speakers have either discussed or diplomatically declined to discuss or avoided discussion of our strange national obsession at present with precluding hypothetical threats of future carnage, even as we ignore and do nothing about carnage and escalating mayhem that is taking place right now in the Holy Land. On Thursday, the President promises to explain our stand on these issues, and I hope that his address to the United Nations will help us, and me in particular, because I'm very selfish on this subject, to understand how we should respond to the view of friends in the region that it is nothing short of obscene to be planning to add a U.S. war in the northern Gulf to existing U.S. backing for steadily escalating war in the Holy Land. And how, I'd like to know also how we should respond to the judgment of allies and friends in Europe and Asia that the notion of preemptive attack at will by the United States amounts both to a return to the pre-modern notion that might makes right and to an abandonment of a century of largely successful American effort to create a rules-based international society. The President's willingness to join a debate on these issues and related matters, as 5 members of his cabinet suddenly did yesterday, is welcome indeed. And it may help to replace oppressive groupthink by a handful of pundits and right-wing politicians within the Beltway with a wider and more reasoned discussion. Over much of this year, in relation to regime change in Baghdad, Washington has resembled nothing so much as a dog determinedly chasing a car, caught up in the joy of the chase and apparently unable or unwilling to consider what risks it runs by yapping at speeding vehicles, or what it might do if it actually caught up with them and could sink its teeth into their tires. Perhaps it's time to put the dog on a leash or set it to chasing something else. There are, I think, a few specific and not inconsequential questions that we might usefully ponder before launching an unprovoked but preemptive attack on Iraq. And in my brief time with you today, I'm going to try to do just that, state a few questions. Let me say here that I don't expect, nor do I call upon, nor should you expect, General Tommy Franks to answer these questions. These are questions for the civilians who are supposed to provide policy guidance to the generals about what it is they are supposed to accomplish and within what parameters. Therefore, General Franks, you can relax and enjoy the questions because you may yourself share some of them. I agree, of course, that there's no reason to doubt that Iraq, like North Korea and Iran, is actively seeking nuclear weapons. But why would changing the Iraqi regime end this effort? I'm going to just state a series of questions. Why does Iraq want chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons in the first place? Is this a strategy that springs from the evil mind of Saddam Hussein? Or is it a strategy based on an Iraqi national interest in deterring a resumption of past assaults by Iran, Israel, Turkey, and the United States? What, in fact, is Iraq's defense against Israeli and Iranian weapons of mass destruction other than its own weapons of mass destruction? Is it the UN Charter? Is the United Nations Charter now an effective constraint on American, Israeli, or Iranian actions against Iraq? Would regime change by itself alter the geostrategic challenges facing Baghdad, or in any way redefine Iraqi national interests? Let me be more specific. Might not a democratically elected Iraqi government be just as interested in weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent as a democratically elected government of Israel has proven to be interested in fact, to develop such weapons? If regime change is the answer, what was the question? But mightn't Saddam attack the United States? Of course, if the international community were to accept the proposed doctrine of preemptive attack, then he probably would be justified in preemptively attacking the United States, given all the threats that we have been uttering against him for the last several years. So why hasn't he? Is there any reason to doubt that Saddam doesn't understand the strength of the United States and the magnitude of our retaliation against him if he does attack us? Is there any evidence that Saddam or his regime are suicidal? Stupid as Saddam is, why, given all our bluster, would he not by now have prepared and possibly prepositioned retaliation against the U.S. homeland? Think about it. Isn't the most likely, indeed almost the only conceivable circumstance leading to an Iraqi attack on the United States a U.S. attack on Iraq that leaves Saddam with nothing to lose by retaliating against us? Now, given his behavior, why should we accept the assertion that Saddam cannot be deterred? He didn't use weapons of mass destruction in 1991, despite the fact that he possessed such weapons. He is an aggressor, but I would argue a cowardly one who attacks only the weak and the unprepared. He attacked an internationally isolated Iran to the quiet, well, not so quiet applause of many Americans. And later, he attacked a regionally isolated Kuwait to the apparent indifference of Americans. He has not rebuilt a significant capacity for offense against his neighbors. With the exception of a despicable assassination attempt on former President Bush in Kuwait about 10 years ago, after that President Bush had left office, for which Iraq was duly punished with heavy bombing, Saddam has answered American and British military attacks on him with political rather than military responses. In other words, looking at the pattern of U.S.-Iraqi interaction over the past decade, the use of force has invariably been instigated by the stronger party, that's us, rather than by Iraq, which clearly understands its own relative weakness. Some people might argue that this is a textbook example of deterrence in action. Saddam's neighbors, with the possible apparent exception of Kuwait, I would say, don't consider him to be an active or unmanageable military threat anymore. Surely they know him better, and surely they have more reason to fear him than we do. But why wouldn't it be possible? Why couldn't Saddam just transfer weapons of mass destruction to other enemies of the United States, including al-Qaeda? It's true that the United States has the capacity to unite our enemies against us rather than doing what classic strategic doctrine would suggest is wise, namely to divide them. But is there any evidence that this is actually happening? If the worry is about nuclear weapons, how likely is it that Saddam would celebrate his acquisition of them by immediately turning over control of them to someone other than his own forces? Such acts of generosity are seldom seen in statecraft. Why is this not an instance in which deterrence is possible and in which making it clear where U.S. red lines are would be the best policy? But isn't it better to be safe than sorry? What do we have to lose? Iraq is weak and it's much more vulnerable than North Korea and Iran. Wouldn't invasion be, in the words of a friend of mine, a cakewalk? Well, Iraq, I think, is far weaker at the end of 8 years now than it was. It's clearly far weaker now than it was at the end of 8 years of warfare with Iran, from which it emerged triumphant. And I'd argue, however, that it's probably not any stronger than it was after the U.S. bombing campaign of January 17 to February 23, 1991, and maybe even a little weaker than that. In 1991, I note, Iraqi troops, mainly conscripts, were seeking to hold on to what Iraq had seized in Kuwait. They were not defending Iraq. They had been bombed at the rate of 1 bomb per minute for 37 days. They were politically and emotionally isolated from the Arab world. And was their behavior in February 1991, February 23rd, 1991, when General Franks crossed the border, crossed the Iraqi line of defense, was their behavior then, under those circumstances, a good predictor of the behavior of a much smaller and more professional army defending its motherland against a foreign invasion and backed rather than opposed by Arab opinion? I'm not convinced. But wouldn't Iraqis, like Afghans, welcome liberation by the United States? By all accounts, 10 years of sanctions and intermittent bombing have not endeared the United States to the Iraqi people. We don't seem to have many admirers left inside the country, while there are quite a few in the bars and hotel restaurants of London, Paris, and New York. Sanctions have concentrated patronage in Saddam's hands and allowed him to dispense it to consolidate his power. Why do we accept the speculative statements of people outside Iraq, Iraqis in exile, about Saddam's illegitimacy, as opposed to the much more persuasive and undeniable fact of his undisturbed control of Iraq? Finally, of course, there isn't, as there was in Afghanistan, a civil war in progress. We do not have the option of tipping the balance in an ongoing struggle and thus gaining a relatively easy, quick victory by helping one faction over another. Despite what they say, wouldn't Arab states and European allies welcome Saddam's overthrow if we succeeded in bringing it about? Perhaps so, after the fact, for I think few would lament his passing. But how is this helpful in persuading them to help us up front in mounting a military campaign? Why should we assume that Arabs, in particular, do not mean what they say about a U.S. attack on Iraq, making further cooperation with the United States extremely difficult, if not impossible? And if, as some argue, the U.S.-led democratization of Iraq would catalyze demographic revolutions that would overthrow regimes elsewhere in the Arab world, why should such regimes support this course of action by the United States and thus help to contrive their own demise? How much support, if any, can we expect from NATO allies and Japan? How much acquiescence will they give? Can we take the use of bases in Europe and Japan for granted when these bases are established and exist for purposes of common defense, unrelated to U.S. unilateral actions out of area in Iraq? But doesn't the Afghan operation show that we don't need allies and partners to project enough power to take down the regime in Baghdad? I think, and we have the world's greatest expert on this present, that our ability to project power to Afghanistan has rested on the use of bases in friendly countries in the Persian Gulf and in facilities as well as overflight rights in Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan in particular. It has entailed the conclusion of logistical support agreements with at least 85 different nations. It has required us to refuel our aircraft en route to the region many times in some instances, and it's been crucial to be able to refuel them within the region to reach targets in Afghanistan. In the Gulf War, we based 550,000 troops in theater and we stuffed 23 air bases to the breaking point. If Iraq's neighbors now deny us use of their airspace, ports, and bases, how can we even get there from here, still less sustain large-scale combat operations in Iraq? And why do we assume that an attack on Iraq that is opposed by most of the nations currently supporting or facilitating our Afghan campaign would not lead to their withdrawal of support for our increasingly unpopular operations in Afghanistan? If we succeed in overthrowing the regime in Baghdad, who will join us in occupying it and doing the nation building necessary to reform it, even assuming that that's possible? I'm not sure that thugdoms are easily transformed into democracies. A few remaining questions. How much might war with Iraq cost? Who will pay for it? In the Gulf War, I note, U.S. expenditures came to $60 billion, every cent of which was paid for by someone else. Saudis, $17 billion, Emiratis, $14 billion, Kuwaitis, Japanese, $13 billion, Germans, $11 billion, Qataris, and so on, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and before you know it, it adds up. Saudi Arabia, as I said, alone paid $17 billion to the U.S. and spent an additional $50 billion on fuel, food, equipment, facility modification, and a host of other expenses. In addition to cash transfers to the United States, much support in kind was provided by other nations in the region and farther afield, and our allies paid their own way or were paid for by others. Kuwait paid for its own reconstruction and oversaw it. I think the total cost of the war remains uncalculated, but it's something over $200 billion, not the silly figures you've seen in the press recently. Is the U.S. ready on our own to fund a war with Iraq and the subsequent nation-building effort there? Not a bad question. And I'd add, do we have commitments in place with Saudi Arabia and other oil producers to do what they did in 1990 to 91, which is to forego the opportunity for windfall profits from a spike in oil prices that could have devastated the U.S. and global economies? Are they going to do that again to support an adventure they don't agree with? Why are we so confident, I repeat, that we can transform a thugdom into a democracy? What evidence is there of Iraqi traditions of democracy similar to those of the Weimar Republic or Japan in the 1920s that underlay our successful transformations of Germany and Japan? Who is the equivalent of the Japanese emperor in terms of assuring Iraqi military and civilian cooperation with a U.S. occupation rather than resistance to it along the lines of what we now see in the occupied territories? If by democracy we mean a regime in Iraq that endorses U.S. policies and supports U.S. interests in the Middle East, including those based on our solidarity with Israel, why do we assume that such a regime would have any legitimacy in Iraq or more broadly in the region? And finally, if an Iraqi democracy decided to build weapons of mass destruction for avowedly deterrent purposes, would we respect that democratic decision and support it, as we have elsewhere in the region? I could raise additional questions, but it's late in the day, and these should probably be about enough to get a discussion started. So I will leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman. You have left us with many important questions that might take other session to answer. Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Ambassador Hussein Hassouna, who for some time was shuttling between New York and Washington, but finally since last month now his station is Washington. Please, the floor, sir.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm very happy to be here today. I just made it. I missed the beginning of the conference, but I was in Cairo attending the meeting of the Arab Foreign Ministers, and I hope to be able maybe to give you a little bit of an insight of what happened there, because many of the issues discussed are also the main themes of your conference. Let me first thank again Dr. John Rick Anthony for organizing this event, which has become an annual event. And this year, I think it has particular significance since it comes just 2 days before commemorating the September 11 tragic events. And I see this opportunity to present to our American friends our deepest condolences for those events. They were a blow to the United States. They were a blow to the civilized world and to our common values. And together, we have to overcome it. Let me say that in Cairo, there were many issues on the agenda. Go into the details of discussions, but I can give you my impressions. First of all, I felt a new sense of unity in the Arab League among the foreign ministers. I also felt concern about the events that have taken place, how September 11 had an impact on Arab-American relations, and concern about the future. Concern that the Palestinian and the Arab-Israeli problem was in no way progressing towards the final solution, that we had already one fire, and here were the risks of another fire blowing up in our face in the Middle East, the war against Iraq. And other issues were discussed. Sudan, Libya, the Lockerbie problem, Somalia, the civil war going on there. Let me briefly deal with them in the context of U.S.-Arab relations. First of all, the Arab-Israeli problem. As I said, there was a lot of concern. A lot of concern that the Arab Peace Initiative that was adopted at the summit in Beirut had found no response on the part of Israel, and even has not had the worldwide response on the part of the international community. There were a lot of other initiatives. We know the proposals by President Bush in last June, the vision put forward before that by President Bush before the General Assembly, and then by Secretary of State Powell in Louisville. We know the Europeans also. A few days ago, there was the foreign minister of Denmark that has put forward some proposals. They all talk about visions about the future, visions on which everyone agrees that we should have a two-state solution, that we should have an end of occupation, that we should have security for Israel, for the Palestinians, that the problem of Jerusalem should be settled, and so on, refugees. But how to get there? Is there a roadmap? Do we have a timetable? And first and foremost, do we have the political will to get there? Do we ask the Palestinians always to make concessions? What about the Sharon government? Is Sharon really interested in peace? Does he talk about a final settlement or just an interim settlement? Does he want his own kind of settlement imposed on the Palestinians? No parity, no justice. So these were questions raised. And as you can expect, the 22 countries of the Arab League gave full support to the Palestinians, pledged to continue within their means their financial support, but also urged the United States and the international community to play their role and to assume the responsibilities. We know that the United States doesn't do it alone anymore. The United States works within the quartet. This shows that even the United States, who has been always involved in the Arab-Israeli problem for so long, who has helped the Egyptians and the Israelis, then the Jordanians and the Israelis to reach peace, cannot do it alone. It needs its friends and allies. It needs the Europeans. It needs the Russians. It needs the United Nations. And it needs the Arabs who can help. There were many meetings before between the quartet, and we hope that those meetings will lead to some progress. Programs which will focus on the political dimension of the problem and not just talk about security, because security alone is not the solution. The solution, as the Arab world sees it, is to build on what has been achieved, and not, as Sharon said, to recede all past legal obligations. Oslo has gone away, and to start a new approach. No, we have to build on. Camp David might not have produced results, but it was a beginning. The big issues were discussed. Taba brought us closer to a settlement, and we have to take on from there. And we have the long-term framework, and that is the Arab Initiative, which means peace versus full withdrawal. And we also have the vision put forward, the proposal of President Bush. We all have to work along those lines. So the solution exists, the framework exists, but we need the political will. Another question raised at the foreign ministers' meeting was Libya. Libya was a difficult question. After Lockerbie, there was a solution, a legal solution put forward, and the Arab League played an important role in that. And that was to set up a neutral tribunal in the Netherlands with Scottish judges that decided the case under Scottish law. And there was a verdict. One of the accused was acquitted, and the other one was found guilty. Now, where do we move from here? The Arab world wants to settle this problem once and for all. We want the Security Council to lift the sanctions imposed against Libya. They have been suspended, but now they have to be lifted. And we are hopeful that the tripartite talks that have taken place in London over the last few months, and the last one was, I believe, in June or July, will lead to a solution. We talk now about compensation of the families of the victims. We talk about Libya recognizing some kind of responsibility. And I think that the British have moved forward and are ready now to resume the relationship with the Libyans. And of course, this means also to have their business people go into Libya, where there are tremendous opportunities. We hope that the United States will follow and will accept, after a satisfactory solution, the lifting of the sanctions. Briefly, Sudan. Sudan maybe was not mentioned at the conference, maybe overshadowed by other questions, but Sudan is an important issue for the region, for the Horn of Africa. And the United States has played an important role in Sudan. Senator Danforth was appointed by President Bush. He has put forward some proposals to reach a ceasefire in a certain area in Sudan, the Nubian mountain. There were some international observers sent, and there was the military committee of the government and also of the liberation, the movement for the southern Sudan that are in place. Later on, there was a protocol signed in Kenya about an overall settlement, and it dealt with many issues of how to deal with the question of the differences in religion between the North and the South, the question of sharing of resources, the question of self-determination for the South, which raised some problems, and what kind of relationship, political system will exist after a transitional period of 6 years. What happened is that the agreement that was reached also over the summer did not deal with the ceasefire and left it to a later stage. And unfortunately, the rebels, as we call them, or the popular movement of the South, overran a major city, and after the talks, the atmosphere was clouded again, and the government of Sudan has vowed to retake the city, and now, of course, things are a bit in a shambles. So I think what we need now is again to work together, and we need the United States to remain committed. We need the countries of the region, like Egypt, which is very much concerned about the developments, to help the Sudanese to reach a solution and to end this bloody war that has been going on for so many years. So this is another example how the United States has played a positive role in one of the big issues in the region. Now coming to Iraq, I think that we have heard a lot about Iraq already, but let me just describe it from my own experience. I was in the United Nations representing the League for 5 years. I've been following this problem for so long. How I see it. I see Iraq having 3 dimensions. A inter-Arab problem, a Iraqi UN problem, and an Iraqi US problem. The inter-Arab problem has evolved since the summit in Beirut, where Iraq has recognized to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Kuwait. There have been some developments. The media campaigns have stopped to a great extent between Iraq and its neighbors. Iraq has agreed to give back to Kuwait the national archives, which it had taken away from Kuwait during the Gulf War, and this will take place sometime next month in coordination between the United Nations, the League of Arab States, and the parties concerned. So the relationships between Iraq and its neighbors have evolved. Trade agreements have been concluded, business people have been going between the different Arab countries and Iraq. Between the United Nations and Iraq, the Arab League has been instrumental in the dialogue that had started on settling the problems between the United Nations and Iraq. The Secretary General went to Baghdad, the Secretary General of the League, in January of this year. He met President Saddam Hussein, and after long talks convinced him to resume the dialogue with the United Nations Secretary General. There were 3 sessions of dialogue. The last one that took place in Vienna in July. They have not brought about a final solution, but at least they have focused on the problems. And we hope in the Arab League, and this was the feeling of everyone present in Cairo, that the government of Iraq will continue the dialogue, will accept the return of the inspectors, and that eventually the problems will be solved, including the lifting of the sanctions which have been so damaging to the civilian population in Iraq. It is a difficult problem. It needs more talk, but we see it the only solution if we want to avoid war in the region. I don't want to get involved into the third level, which is the question of the United States' relationship with Iraq. I think there's an intense dialogue going on in this country at the moment. But what I notice is that I think the President of the United States is very keen, before reaching a decision, to seek the opinion of the friends and the allies. And this is extremely important. Because we, the people in the Arab world, are the ones who are going to suffer from all the consequences of a devastating war. And I think our opinion is important. We do not have to go into all the consequences and ramifications of a war in the Middle East, but it might dismember a country. It will provoke, maybe it will affect the outflow of oil, might destabilize the whole region, and the public opinion in the Arab world will be enraged. It is already enraged against what's happening to the Palestinian people. It might also be enraged what happens, especially if there are many casualties, as a lot of people predict in any coming war. So this is a very serious matter, I think. And I know the United States government is consulting. I know the United States government is consulting with the Security Council, which also, in my view, is very important to preserve the unity of the Security Council to deal with such serious matters. If we have a divided Security Council, I think the United Nations will be much less effective than if the Council is united and gives full mandate to the Secretary General and full mandate to the inspection teams if there is agreement for them to go back to Iraq. U.S.-Arab relations, I don't want to go very long, but U.S.-Arab relations were also discussed in Cairo. And for the first time, there were leaders of the Arab American community present there. We had Jim Zogby, we had Ziad Asali, we had some leaders from Detroit. And they took part in the discussion with the ministers. And for over 3.5 hours, there was a good discussion about what happened, what can we do, where are we going. I don't want to go into the details, but I can tell you again, there was worry, but there was also a feeling that we want good relationships with the United States. The United States is a friend of the Arab world, and the Arab world is a friend of the United States. It's a two-way relationship, and we have so much common interests, which sometimes is overlooked. But also there was a feeling that whatever happened, we were shocked that those terrorists came from the Arab world. But we were already the victims of terrorism before those events. And we do not accept the notion of collective guilt. We should work together with the United States and with the rest of the world to track down the terrorists, to get rid of those who kill innocent people. But we should not be blamed for their doing, because they don't represent the Arab world, they don't represent mainstream of Islam. Islam calls for the sanctity of the human life. Where are we now? In my view, the present state of Arab-American relationships can be summarized as follows. I think the relationships are proceeding on two tracks, two different tracks. One is the official track, the responsible one, the rational one, that takes into account the enormous common interest we have, and that realizes that sometimes there are abuses, sometimes there is wrongdoing on both sides, that we need some self-criticism. We need to change our discourse, maybe. And we need reform, especially in the Arab world. But we admit it. And to prove that, the first Human Development Report was issued by the United Nations together with the League of Arab States. And it was announced in a ceremony by the League of Arab States. It contains self-criticism of the Arab world, its deficiencies, its weaknesses. But we don't hide ourselves anymore. We recognize what is wrong, but we are also proud of our achievements. The second trend, I think, this is the irresponsible trend of some people who are either ignorant or have their own agenda. And those do a lot of damage to a long-standing relationship between the Arab world and the United States. And I think we should stand up against them and speak up against them, because they can derail our relationship and they can influence public opinion. They can engender more hatred. They can radicalize public opinion, and they are a danger. This is how I see it. At the same time, I think, looking into the future, we have to work together. One of the things which will be happening is that next year, in May, a conference on Arab relationship will take place in Detroit. It will be a comprehensive conference dealing with not only the political aspects, the cultural, but mainly focus on the economic aspects of our relationship, which are deep. We talk about $45 million of trade. We talk of billions of dollars of investment from the Arab world in this country. So it is not a small amount. And this conference, I hope, will refocus on our common interests to develop those relationships. In conclusion, I think we need a long-term vision. We have to go beyond these events and this tension in our relationship. We need more tolerance. We need to understand that we have common goals, and that is why we also should work together. Today, terrorism or poverty or peace cannot be achieved by one country alone. It is a common endeavor. We all have to join hands. And if we do so, I think we will win. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Hassouna. In the interest of time, I will refer you to General Franks' printed biography and resume in the program. This is his third time addressing this annual conference, which is something that we treasure and value highly, and it has become a tradition that the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command address this annual gathering. And many of the ones that we had in the early to mid-1990s, there was oftentimes a September surprise. And this made it necessary for some people to not come to the conference because of the crisis that was on the horizon then. Last year, of course, we had more than a surprise. We had the shock of our lives. We had not only General Franks, but his two immediate predecessors also addressing the conference. So we had a total of 12 stars at that particular session. And only hours after the conference occurred did we enter another era in our relationship with a place halfway around the world from us. And I will depart from my comments here to simply italicize, neonize, and capitalize on the extraordinary, onerous, awesome responsibility that this man bears. Its geographic reach almost defies description. The nomenclature of the countries where he looks out for American and Allied interest is quite foreign, even to specialists sitting in this room. And for most of Americans, the pronunciation, the spelling of the countries that are involved in his area of responsibility is itself its own spelling bee's a major challenge. Many others can recognize these countries, but perhaps are not aware of whether they're animal, vegetable, or mineral, not being household words. But his reach extends from the single most populous Arab country in terms of Egypt, which represents 1 out of 4 of all Arabs on this planet, to East Africa, which has its own time-honored relations with the peoples of Arabia and lands east, plus the Eastern Mediterranean, stretching into the Gulf and into the Caspian and what is known as South Asia or Southwest Asia. No commander in Europe, no commander in Southcom in Latin America, no commander in Asia has as complex and diverse a set of challenges as does our EndNotes speaker this afternoon. We share one thing in common, which perhaps many people are not aware with regard to General Franks, that is, and that is neither one of us went directly to college or university. In our teens, either the universities weren't ready for us or we weren't ready for them. In my case, it was a combination of both. In any case, we shared the same schooling as teenagers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and trained in U.S. Army artillery as forward observers. There, the synonym and the similarity stops. With regard to General Franks, here is an individual who is literally at the tip and the point of the spear, representing America's interest on the strategic issues of war and peace, regional stability, and the projection and the protection of all that are America's institutions, individuals, institutions, interest, and investments in this region. General Franks.
Well, John Duke, wow. Wonderful to share that Fort Sill experience. And excellencies and friends and representatives of wonderful nations with whom our own nation has had such substantial and terribly important ties for so long. I think this is a great forum because it gives an opportunity to look at the left and to look at the right and to look at the center as we're able to divine it. I think this forum represents an opportunity to share ideas, to influence as appropriate, to learn, to gain, and to contribute. And I in fact, have enjoyed the time that I have spent with you. I am very much aware that as I stand here now, I am the last human who will stand between you and an evening of relaxation. John Duke, thanks a lot. We have an opportunity to maintain relationships, build new ones, to give, to take, and to learn, and so truly, it's an honor for me to be here today and have a chance to share with you what I have on my mind. The 10th of September of last year, almost a year to the day, the last conference, the last time that I had an opportunity to speak to this group. I talked about a wide range of security issues, things perceived to be important in U.S.-Arab relationships in the region. I talked about terrorism on that day. And I talked about the fact that our own country was not immune to terrorist attack, still isn't. We talked about that on that day. We knew then that it was an issue of not if, but when. Tony Zinni was fond of saying that a few years back. Both he and I continue to say it. I also talked about a year ago today about the magnificent support that we had received from every nation in the GCC and a variety of others in the region in terms of providing force protection for our people, forward staged and forward present in that area. I talked about weapons of mass destruction. We talked about who had them. We talked about who wanted them. We talked about why. We talked about the threat that the potential proliferation of such weapons represent to the region and to the world. We talked about Iraq. We talked about Iran. We talked about programs as they existed at that time. I talked on that day about the importance of defense cooperation. I congratulated my friends for the wonderful relationships we have, professional and personal. I left the conference, got on a plane, got as far as Greece, stopped to get gas, turned on CNN, and along with a great many of you, watched a plane strike the second tower in New York. Got back on the plane, came home, received some guidance from Secretary of Defense, went to work, and as they say, the remaining 11 or so months represent history. Not just an attack on America, it's been said. I'll say it again. Day after tomorrow will represent the one-year anniversary of an attack on 80 nations of the world. An attack by an enemy different from past foes, asymmetric, ruthless, no code of conduct tied to values we recognize, an attack on the peoples of the world who seek something better for their children, for their grandchildren, for next generations. But it wasn't the first attack of this type, either on Americans or on others. In the case of the Americans, I remember Beirut, Khobar Towers, U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, USS Cole. The difference a year ago was that this attack awakened the world. Awakened the world in a way which we should all applaud, all those who stand for freedom, liberty, and a chance for children, grandchildren, and posterity in the future. So we acted. Beginning on the 7th of October of last year, we stand today with a coalition of more than 70 nations, more than 70,000 men and women, friends and allies in the face of the threat. Arab nations, the GCC, all of them. Jordan, Egypt, Yemen, and on and on. As they've been joined by Pakistan, countries of Central Asia, and the Horn of Africa. In fact, as I stand here today, 39 of these nations are represented with national liaison cells at our headquarters in Tampa, Florida, and literally thousands of their troops are committed to this effort. Problems, as described here, to be sure. The world has changed over the past year. The world has changed because Americans have a view of the sanctity of life and children and grandchildren. Our view has changed. But in a great many cases, our relationships, rather than contracting, have expanded. Based on a foundation of some 50 years in Bahrain, as I think about it. And going back to 1933 with Saudi Arabia. Interesting to me that over the course of these times we have seen in our relationships highs and we have seen lows. But at the end of the day, we have stood together in the face of what has been perceived as enemies of the mutual interests of our countries. It seems to me that the relationships that we see today have formed the foundation, have set the stage for the success of our efforts against terrorism. A coalition of the willing, what's that mean? That means that the mission was defined, laid before the nations of the world, and then the coalition was formed. One of the largest coalitions in the history of the world stands together today, joined by representatives of the nations represented here today. Basing, staging, overflight, economic contributions of military force of every shape and size, liaison, military forces from countries like Jordan, who has completed demining operations inside Afghanistan of more than 100,000 square meters of land, and in fact has treated more than 100,000 patients at a hospital in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan. Brave leadership, and I congratulate the leader. Pakistani troops who have stood with us from beginning until today in this effort as the nation of Pakistan evolves. I applaud that. We welcome it. And because of the relationships that I've just described, the Taliban no longer executes people in the soccer stadium in Kandahar. The Taliban has been removed from power, and Afghanistan, while far from perfect, no longer serves as a harbor for growth and support of terrorist networks, terrorist leaderships. The Afghan people are free in a troubled and murky environment, but they have something that they didn't have a year ago. They have a chance. They have a chance. Women who had never seen a doctor now have a chance. Children have a chance to go to school. Involvement, leadership by my own country, to be sure, but with dramatic contributions by those nations represented here today. Powerful testament to the depth of relationship. Al-Qaeda's on the run. Nations on this planet have taken thousands of people who would support terrorist activity over the past year. Some 700 or so we have taken out of Afghanistan. They represent 44 nations. They speak a great many languages. In no way do they represent Islam, and they represent a great many more than the Arab nations here today. This is not about East and West. This is about good and evil. Look, this is not a war we sought, but it is a war we'll win together, because it's about not only stability in the region and security of people in the region, and about 23 million people in Afghanistan. This is about the future. And it is a war we will win. Now, with all of that, we continue to focus our efforts on terrorism across the region, on weapons of mass destruction across the region. We continue to focus on the environment. We continue to read the indicators. We read history. We recognize prediction is difficult. There are many things we don't know. There are many things we do know. We continue to enforce United Nations sanctions, which have been flaunted. I believe the number is between 15 and 20. United Nations Security Council resolutions, which have been flaunted over the past 11 years. We continue to fly operations Southern Watch and Northern Watch in accordance with and in order to enforce resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. And young men are fired at on virtually every one of those missions. Some 16,000 sorties flown last year in Operation Southern Watch alone. We continue to enforce sanctions through maritime interdiction with wonderful support from the GCC. Having boarded more than 1,800 ships last year and having found 337 of them not in compliance with Security Council resolutions. In order to remove illicit revenue from a regime under sanction. We maintain Desert Spring forces for the sole purpose of preventing miscalculation on the part of a regime which, as I said, has flaunted Security Council resolutions since the first in 1991, where the regime declared that it would disarm. We continue to focus on cooperative defense initiative, active and passive defense systems, shared early warning, consequence management, command and control. We accomplish much. We demand much of ourselves and much of our relationships, mutual relationships, professional and friendships. The business with terrorism has a long ways to go. It's been said we're closer to the beginning than we are to the end. Truth, to be sure. The challenges we face in our relationships are many, as they've been described here this afternoon. They range from environmental security to terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Our ability to work together has been critical, remains critical, and will into the future. Indeed, much remains to be done. That's why we all work so hard to get it done. Again, John Duke, thanks very much for giving me a chance to come and share with all of you. We appreciate the relationships. We look to the future. Thanks a lot.
We have a recommendation from one thoughtful individual saying that given the late hour and the impressive speeches that no questions be taken. That's quite different than no prisoners be taken. This one, though, is, I think, one that hasn't ordinarily been asked in the media at all. And General Franks, if you would be willing to take this question. It is a reference to Japan and Germany after World War II, where an occupying authority had no choice but to remain engaged extensively, intensively with regard to restructuring, reconfiguring the polity of those two countries. This is an aspect of the Iraq scenario that people are just beginning to touch on. But I think we would welcome from you as to whether there are any analogies. Are there any lessons learned from those two previous sagas that can be extrapolated from in terms of the staying power, the moral resolve, the stick-to-itiveness of the United States in the event? Perhaps the hypothetical aspect of it rules out even the answering of the question. But if you could share with us any thoughts that you might have on that quite arduous, almost unprecedented American involvement in the region following any reconfiguration of Iraq.
Let me dodge the frenzy a bit. Let me talk about Afghanistan and staying power, and perhaps those who are interested will extrapolate with respect to staying power. My experience for about 37 years has been that the best a military operator at any level can have is thoughtful, crisp, clear, direct guidance, and the resources with which to do his job. My sense is that our entry into Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan was preceded by such thoughtfulness, and the guidance which I have received, as well as the contributions of coalition members since that time, has been entirely understandable and remains committed to the future. This is not a business undertaken lightly, undertaken based on thought, consultation, commitment for the long haul. That's about Afghanistan. And I made myself a deal with my boss, Secretary of Defense, that if he'd let me do my job, I'd try real hard to leave the policy decisions to he and the President, and I think I'll stay with that. Thanks.
We have another question that hasn't been asked, and this is to Ambassador Hassouna, and then I'll ask a nice forward-looking one from General Franks, and that'll be the last one. Ambassador Hassouna, what would be the likely reaction of the League of Arab States if the United States were to go it alone and unilaterally wage its campaign against Iraq?
Well, it's a problematic question. We don't know yet what the developments are. As a professional diplomat, I'm always optimistic that a solution could be found even at the last minute. So I don't always share the gloom of some people, because it's only under pressure sometimes that solutions emerge. I've seen this. I've been negotiating many crises in my diplomatic life, including between Israel and Egypt, and we solved issues, but it was always at the last minute under pressure of circumstances and events. So let's hope that there can be a solution. But as I said, in Cairo, the foreign ministers expressed their opposition to any military attack against any Arab country, including Iraq. So it's a matter of principle. It's a matter of principle that the members of the League of Arab States are entitled to have their sovereignty, territorial integrity respected. This is consistent with the Charter of the United Nations. They also saw that, as I mentioned, dialogue is the only way to settle this difficult problem. And they also expressed the view that weapons of mass destruction should be dealt with not only with regard to Iraq, but with regard to any country in the region, including Israel. And if we go back to the resolution adopted in 1991, Resolution 687, paragraph 14 of that resolution says that the international community is resolved to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction which Iraq might have or develop, as a first step to establish a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, including that the weapons of Israel should also be the targets of our efforts. So this is the position of the Arab world. How the Arab world will react, I don't have a crystal ball, And I still say that I hope that eventually there will be a peaceful solution of the problem.
Thank you, Dr. Hassouna. Last question, General Franks. What is being done to win the war of ideas?
I think what we're sitting here with today is part of it. I think when consultations are undertaken, I think when our own president stands before the American people and stands before the world, states his views, states his concerns, says that in the face of what we see, the one thing we cannot do is continue business as usual. We have initiated the process of the exchange of ideas. It is the way of our nation to lead, not to apologize, but to lead. I think we'll watch to see the way the ideas are put on the table. We'll watch to see the ideas exchanged, debated, discussed, as I think we should. And so winning the war of ideas, I think the first step has been made. And as the ambassador said, I think it was Yogi Berra who said, prediction is really hard, especially if it has to do with the future.
Great. Before thanking our end notice, before thanking our end notice and all of our attendees, registrants, and sponsors, we are amongst the adult crowd here. Nothing more than the shoulders of those that we stand upon who went before us. But all of us have an obligation to try to pass the baton to those who will come after us. And in an organization such as the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations and the U.S.-GCC Corporate Cooperation Committee and all the other fine organizations who have rolled up their sleeves, put their shoulders to the wheel to make this conference possible, we've done it not so much through the grown-ups, but through young people. And most of the young people that we have been working with are but now in their 20s. And they've gained a lot from being here, but you've gained the more because of what they did to bring you here. I would ask that these stand from the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations and take a bow to the audience. And there are the following individuals that I would ask to stand to because they've met with us almost weekly for months now. David Bosch, Elizabeth Hall, Ambassador Hassouna, Les Janka, Neil Lindemann, Vaughn Fitzpatrick, and Patrick Ryan. This conference stands adjourned. We look forward to another one next year at this time. Thank you so much.
Do you consider yourself a typical 14-year-old?
Well, there are so many dimensions to typical. I like baseball. I go to school as many days as everyone else, and I get the same amount of homework. I like to visit friends on the weekends and have fun. But also, I have 2,500 used and rare books.
This Saturday at 8 a.m. and noon Eastern on Book TV, meet Basie Gitlin, collector.
I don't love it that we can't open doorways all the way. But
Join Basie and his family as they walk us through his collection of children's, history, and other rare books. This Saturday at 8 and noon on Children's Books on Book TV.
You got to have